He was a college dropout who studied calligraphy and Zen Buddhism. He was a ruthless, cutthroat CEO who could make grown men cry. He was a man who could be incredibly cruel to the people closest to him, but who created products that brought joy, connection, and a sense of wonder to billions. Steve Jobs was a hurricane of contradictions, and in his definitive and masterful biography, Walter Isaacson gives us an unflinching front-row seat to the storm. This is not just the story of the man who co-founded Apple, who was fired from his own company, and who returned to save it from bankruptcy and lead it to become the most valuable company in the world. It is a deep, philosophical, and stunningly honest look into the mind of a flawed genius who, more than any other single person, shaped the reality of our 21st century lives. This is the story of the philosophy, the passion, and the demons that put a dent in the universe. To understand the philosophy of Apple, you first have to understand the two very different Steves who created it in a suburban garage in 1976. The story of Apple is the story of a perfect and unlikely fusion of two different kinds of genius. On one side you had Steve Wozniak, the Woz. Wozniak was the gentle, brilliant, and pure-hearted engineering wizard. He was a true hobbyist, a member of the Homebrew Computer Club, who saw computers not as a business, but as a wonderful tool for individual empowerment. He was the one who, with his own hands, designed and built the circuit board for the Apple I and the revolutionary Apple II, the machine that would essentially create the personal computer industry. On the other side you had Steve Jobs. Jobs was not an engineer in the traditional sense, he was something else entirely. He was the visionary, the marketer, the artist. Having grown up in the counterculture of the 1960s, he had traveled to India in search of enlightenment, he had experimented with psychedelic drugs, and he had a deep appreciation for things that went far beyond technology. He had famously audited a calligraphy class at Reed College after dropping out, an experience that he said would later inform his obsession with the beautiful fonts on the Macintosh. This was Jobs' unique genius. He stood at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. While the other computer companies of the time were building ugly beige boxes for businesses, Jobs had a different vision. He believed that a computer could be a beautiful object, a tool for creativity, a bicycle for the mind that could be elegant, simple, and intuitive enough for an ordinary person to use. The partnership was a perfect yin and yang. Wozniak built a brilliant machine, and Jobs knew how to package it, how to market it, and how to sell it, not as a piece of hardware, but as a dream. This fusion of brilliant engineering and artistic, human-centered design would become the core DNA of Apple for the next 40 years. As Apple grew from a garage startup into a major corporation, the leadership style of Steve Jobs began to take shape. And it was a style that was as brilliant as it was, at times, terrifying. The engineers who worked for him at the time described his unique and powerful brand of charisma as the reality distortion field. The reality distortion field was Jobs' almost supernatural ability to convince himself, and everyone around him, that the impossible was possible. He would look at a team of engineers and tell them to do something that they knew, based on the laws of physics and the limits of their own abilities, could not be done. He would stare at them, unblinking, and tell them, "Don't be afraid, you can do it." And then, through a combination of his charisma, his passion, and his sheer relentless refusal to accept no as an answer, they would somehow, miraculously, do it. This reality distortion field was the driving force behind the creation of the first Macintosh, the project that was Jobs' true passion. The Mac was his attempt to build a computer that was insanely great. It would be the first mass-market computer with a graphical user interface and a mouse, a machine that you could communicate with, not through lines of code but through intuitive visual icons. The development of the Mac was a legendary and brutal process. Jobs drove his team to the brink of exhaustion. He was a brutal perfectionist. He would obsess over every single detail, from the curve of the case to the color of the icons on the screen. He was famous for his explosive temper and his brutally honest and often cruel feedback. He would tell an engineer to their face that their work was shit. But he also infused the team with a sense of being on a mission from God. They were not just building a computer, they were artists, they were pirates, and they were changing the world. This ability to inspire and to terrorize in equal measure was the core of his leadership. But his obsessive, uncompromising style also created powerful enemies within the company. Apple was now a large, publicly traded corporation, and Jobs was seen by the professional CEO he had hired, John Sculley, and the board of directors, as a chaotic and unmanageable force. In 1985, in a stunning boardroom coup, the man who had created Apple was unceremoniously fired from his own company. It was a devastating public humiliation. The next decade of Steve Jobs' life is what's often called his wilderness years. But as Isaacson shows, this period of exile was not a failure. It was the crucible in which the mature, and ultimately far more effective, Steve Jobs was forged. After leaving Apple, he did two things. First, he founded a new computer company called NeXT. The NeXT computer was, in many ways, the ultimate Steve Jobs product. It was a perfect, elegant, and technologically brilliant black cube. It was also a complete and utter commercial failure. It was too expensive, and it was too far ahead of its time. But the software that his team at NeXT developed, a powerful and stable operating system, was a masterpiece. And, in a beautiful twist of fate, that software would one day become the foundation for the return of Apple. The second, and far more successful thing he did, was to buy a small, struggling computer graphics company from George Lucas. The company was called Pixar. At Pixar, Jobs learned a new set of lessons. He was not the product visionary in the way he was at Apple. The creative genius at Pixar was John Lasseter, the director of what would become Toy Story. For the first time in his life, Jobs was in a secondary role. He learned to be the patron, the protector of a creative culture that was not his own. He learned the art of building a business that could support and empower other creative geniuses. His investment in Pixar, which he bought for $5 million, would eventually make him a billionaire when Disney bought the company years later. His time in the wilderness taught him patience. It taught him the importance of sustainable business models. And it taught him humility, in its own painful way. He had been the golden boy of American business, and he had been publicly cast out. This period of failure was the necessary fire that burned away some of his youthful arrogance and prepared him for his second coming. By 1997, the company that had fired Steve Jobs was on the brink of bankruptcy. Apple, under a series of professional but uninspired CEOs, had lost its way. It had a confusing and bloated product line. It had lost its innovative edge, and it was just a few months away from running out of cash. In a desperate move, the Apple board brought Steve Jobs back, first as an advisor and then as the interim and eventually permanent CEO. And what he did next is one of the greatest turnaround stories in the history of business. His first move was an act of brutal, clarifying focus. He gathered his top executives in a room, and in front of a giant whiteboard, he drew a simple 2x2 grid. At the top, he wrote consumer and pro. On the side, he wrote desktop and portable. And then he said, "This is our new product line. We are going to make one great product for each of these four boxes, and we are going to cancel everything else." With this single ruthless act, he eliminated over 70% of Apple's products. He killed off successful but unfocused projects. He enraged entire divisions of the company, but he saved Apple. He brought back the one thing it had lost: focus. His philosophy was clear: deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do. With this new focus and using the powerful NeXT operating system that he brought back with him, he began a period of creative output that is almost unparalleled in the history of any company. First came the iMac, a fun, colorful, all-in-one computer that made the sea of beige PC boxes look instantly obsolete. Then came the iPod, which completely revolutionized the music industry. Then came the iPhone, a device that didn't just change the phone industry, it changed the very nature of human interaction. And then the iPad, which created an entirely new category of computing. Each of these products was an expression of his core, unifying philosophy. It was the philosophy of the integrated end-to-end system. Unlike Microsoft, which just made the software, or Dell, which just made the hardware, Jobs insisted that Apple must control the entire user experience. He believed that the only way to create a truly simple, elegant, and seamless product was to design the hardware, the software, and even the retail store where it was sold, as one, single, cohesive thought. This was the philosophy of the closed system, and it was the secret to Apple's magic. No story of Steve Jobs would be complete or honest without confronting the difficult and often ugly parts of his personality. And Walter Isaacson's biography does not shy away from this. It is an unflinching and deeply reported look at the man's flaws. Jobs could be a tyrant. He was famous for his temper, for his brutal and often public humiliation of his own employees. He had a binary view of the world. In his mind, you were either a genius or a bozo. An idea was either the best thing ever or it was shit. There was no in between. This created a culture of intense pressure and fear, but also one where A players felt they could do their best work, free from the mediocrity of B players. And his cruelty was not just confined to the workplace. The most painful story in the book is his initial, and for many years his cruel denial of his own daughter Lisa. Even after a paternity test had proved he was the father, it is a story of profound emotional immaturity and a deep and perhaps unforgivable wound that he inflicted on his own child. So, this brings us to the great and uncomfortable philosophical question of the book. Was Steve Jobs' difficult asshole personality necessary for his genius? Did you have to have the darkness to get the light? Isaacson doesn't give an easy answer. He shows that the same intense, reality-distorting personality that made him so difficult to be around was also the source of his incredible creative power. His refusal to accept no as an answer, his fanatical perfectionism, his belief that the normal rules did not apply to him, these were the very same traits that allowed him to push his teams to create products that no one else thought were possible. But the book also suggests that these were the traits of a deeply wounded and insecure person. Jobs was given up for adoption as a baby, a fact that, Isaacson argues, left him with a deep and abiding fear of abandonment, and a powerful need to control his environment. His story is a complex and often tragic portrait of a man whose great gifts and his great flaws were, in the end, inextricably and perhaps tragically intertwined. The final message of Steve Jobs' life is not just in the beautiful objects he created, it is in the powerful and uncompromising philosophy he embodied. It was a philosophy of passion, of focus, of a relentless and sometimes brutal pursuit of perfection. It was a belief in the power of intuition, and in the magic that can happen when you stand at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. It was a deep, abiding, and almost spiritual desire to create tools that would empower people and, in his own famous words, put a dent in the universe. It is a deep inquiry into the very nature of genius. If you are a person who is inspired by the stories of the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels who change our world, then you are in the right place. Welcome to Geeky Philosopher. Subscribe, and let's continue to explore the lives and the philosophies of the people who shaped our reality.